In the second distinct period, I'll cover the alchemists. What were their goals? I'll highlight some neglected Persian historical scientists. I'll talk about the Dark Ages, the Enlightenment, and the Age of Reason. Let's take a look.
In our previous section, we talked about the theorists. The theorists sat around and thought about what the smallest thing was. The alchemists, alchemist coming from the Arabic al, meaning the, and chemi, which is an Egyptian derivation from chemi, meaning the black land, and Greek chyma, meaning the casting of metals. So when you put all this together, it's the mystical black land casting of metals. And that describes what the alchemists really did. The alchemists had three distinct goals. First and foremost, they hoped to turn base metals that were inexpensive, like lead and copper, into the precious metals gold and silver in order to trick or fool other people. And what they could do here is take lead and copper, which were easily mined and refined, and if you could take lead, which had a silver gray color, and turn it into a shiny silver, and then say, hey, look, this is silver, somebody would pay you for that silver. And if you could take copper, which is a reddish brown metal, and you could give it a goldish color, then you could trick people again into thinking that was gold, and you could get lots of money or barter or trade for that item. So Zosimus published 28-volume Encyclopedia of Alchemy, and in this it described all the methods the alchemists used in order to change inexpensive metals into precious metals. And it had a lot of other things written in there, but this book was burned when the Roman Empire came in and took over and conquered the area that he was from. The second thing that alchemists tried to do was create potions to make people live forever. Now, this has its basis from the Chinese, and the Chinese came up with making elixirs, long history of making elixirs, and that purportedly made people live forever or for a long time. So from the Greek and the Arab combination, the alchemists made these potions. And finally, the third, and probably most honorable, was to discover medicines. And medicines were substances that were used to treat or heal people. Different than making a potion to make you live forever, medicines actually healed people. And Pericles is the most famous of the early alchemists. He was a German, and he documented everything that was known about disease, and he proposed cures using all that was known. He wrote all this down. So Pericles is generally thought of as the father of modern medicine, even though it was still medieval or before. Now, I've included a period here about the Arabs. The Arabs are often overlooked in the Western history of the world. The Chinese, obviously, the Japanese, the Indians are overlooked, but the Arabs, because that area of the Middle East was taken over, the European model didn't mention much about the Arabs. So I want to include three really distinct or important individuals who contributed much to alchemy.
Okay, now for the Arabs. The Arabs are singularly important because of how much material they published and was passed on and became universal texts for all of the European and descendants model. So our first Persian here is Geber, Persian alchemist. including distillation and crystallization methods. He discovered all the basic acids: hydrochloric acid, nitric acid, citric acid, acetic acid, and tartaric acids. Al-Razi, Persian chemist, he wrote 184 books. Now, these books aren't books as we know them. They're more like pamphlets. They're more like scrolls of information. In these books, he wrote about distillation, extraction, sulfuric acid preparation, ethanol preparation. He had The Secret of Secrets. It was a 3-part series. In the first part, he listed all the known apparatus and glassware that was made. Second part, all the recipes and techniques that were known. And the third, the list of chemicals and minerals known. So this became the preeminent text for everything known in the alchemy world. And last, Avicenna. Avicenna is the most famous because we classified him as a chemist besides a physicist. But he also had astronomy and other scholarly works and wrote 450 books. Again, these books weren't books, more like pamphlets. But each of his books covered a different topic, like pharmacopoeia, one on medicine, one on a list of chemicals. And the combined volume of the things he wrote about became the chief medical text that was used well into the 1500s. And so, more so than any Chinese literature written down, or Indian, or Japanese, this Persian text of Avicenna was used throughout Europe and around the world.
Now, what followed the Alchemists is a mystical or magical period and is known as the Dark Ages. It's known as the Dark Ages, and following this period, it's known as the Enlightenment or the Age of Reason. Now, it's quite important to understand why these two eras existed. The Dark Ages was called the Dark Ages because of the lack of advancement that occurred during this period. And the primary reasons that there was a very little advancement is because religion was very harsh and repressive during this period. So if you thought something different than the church, you were often ostracized, called a heretic, and you could be even burned at the stake or put to death in another fashion. So I'm going to point out 3 distinct, important individuals and how they were repressed and how this was evidence of what was going on during this time period. The first incident, the Christians sacked and burned the town or the city of Alexandria when they came and conquered it on the continent of Africa in Egypt. And in Alexandria was the greatest library in early history. The Alexandria Library contained single copies of all known works. And when the Christians came in, they burned the entire library and its contents. And there have been parchments and different books that the only copy that existed was lost forever, and this was a great tragedy in prehistory or before we got to the modern times. A second example of what happened, a preface was put in Copernicus' book. Copernicus wrote a book and then he died, and there was a preface placed in the book to be published upon death, and which stated that everything in his heliocentric or sun-centered ideology of the universe was in fact not true. So if you read this in the beginning of the book, everything that follows isn't true. Why would you believe that the sun was the center of the solar system and not the earth, like what was proposed by all religious organizations? A third example here is that Bruno, very famous scientist of the time, was burned at the stake in 1600 for heresy because he believed that the earth moved around the sun and that the sun didn't move around the earth. So here are two examples of individuals believing that the sun was the center of the solar system and not the earth. And you can see the consequences of their views. And finally, the most famous of all, everyone's heard of Galileo. And Galileo was tried for heresy in 1633, found guilty, and he was placed under house arrest for the remainder of his life because of what he believed and what he had discovered with the Jovian moons and how they orbited the planet Jupiter and matched the rest of our solar system, that the moon revolved around the earth and that the earth revolved around the sun. Now, after this period of time, there was great scientific discovery in all areas of art and science and engineering, and this is called the Enlightenment or Age of Reason. And one of the things that followed was a great philosophical advance. In this remarkable time, so many things that were discovered that we get to our next phase, which is going to be called the experimenters. Now, of all this material here, what do you need to know? A good question that I'm going to ask is, name two of the three things the alchemists were attempting to do or were their goals. And the easiest is for you to say to turn base metals like lead and copper into gold and silver. And most people then put discover medicines. That's great. If you can't remember that, well, you should say create potions to live forever and discover medicines. Anyway, you need two of the three in your essay.